Welcome to Keeping the World Company on ThinkTech Hawaii. I'm your host, Jay Fidell. Today we'll talk about lone wolf terrorism and how it's come to town. Does it also include prepper survivalism? Our co-host for the show is Tim Apicella. Our guests for the show are Gene Rosenfeld, independent scholar, and Manfred Henningsen, emeritus professor in political philosophy, UH Manoa. Welcome to you all. The recent events in New Orleans and Las Vegas reflect an emerging national security and lone wolf terrorism threat to the country. We need to examine the social factors, the political factors, and phenomena involved, since I think everybody feels this is likely to get worse. So, Tim, let's go to you first. What does it show us about this violence? We seem to be having more of it. And if you connect the dots over the past few years, there's no doubt that America is heading not only to a political divide and a social divide, but also a divide in respect for law and order. Your thoughts?
Well, to go to your last point there, respect. We are losing respect for one another, not only as Americans, but as just people in general. Not so much in Europe, I think, and other places in the world, but in the United States, I think we're losing that element we used to call civility, respect for others. We're losing the social fabric of banding together to make life better for Americans. That seems to be dissipating. I think it's a combination of many things. One, the technologies that we've had in our lives now for the last 40, 50 years, in many ways, whether you want to call it the television, social media, or cell phones, they tend to be isolating. The technology is isolating the human condition, people interacting with one another. There used to be a time where you could come up to someone at the workplace and have a conversation. Now they'll just say, don't talk to me, but email me or text me. These conversations, there was a movie about how America used to have social organizations, bowling leagues and fraternal clubs and all sorts of things where Americans used to get together and socialize. Despite their political or religious differences, there was a common thing that brought Americans together. Those seem to be on the way, falling apart and not existent anymore. So with isolation, you have people who I think are prone to more mental illness, depression. We know, we've heard and seen articles about this, about social media and particularly how it affects female girls and young men. So the more isolated you become, the more susceptible you are to social media and the messages of social media, the more susceptible you are to certain political leaders like Mr. Trump, a stochastic speech, stochastic messages, implying this or that, but not explicitly stating it. You have all these things going on at the same time, and then now add a new layer, and that's mental illness. And you have what I call the recipe for a lone wolf killer. Look at United Insurance and Luigi Mangione. Certainly had privilege, certainly had resources, but probably had a falling out. He's at the right age for that, and you saw his manifesto, and it seemed to take the world on, and he was the only one that was going to solve the problem by assassination of the CEO of United Healthcare. So I think it's a multi-layered cake of how we got to this place, and I don't think there's any quick solution to prohibit a lone wolf terrorist who's been influenced by social media, mental illness, or all the above.
Thank you. So well put. Wished I'd said that. Gene, we have a growing uncertainty about the future. Trump helps us with that. He makes everything uncertain. We, as Tim says, we have feelings of isolation, resulting in public mental health issues, polarization, division, dehumanization, loss of caring, civility, respect. We can identify these in the newspaper almost every day. And ultimately built into that is suicidal ideation. These people who do this kind of violence, they know the chances are pretty good they're going to wind up dead. And so it is kind of suicidal. And ultimately, it's violence in terms of large numbers of people against large numbers of people. And that means civil war. So you're into social psychology. You've been following this sort of thing. Terrorism is part of this. And maybe the prepper survivalist movement is part of this. Can you help us connect all these things and answer this one question? Does it all lead inevitably to violence on a large scale?
Not inevitably, no. But when you get a convergence of factors, negative factors, sometimes you have an accident or a catastrophe. It takes more than one particular cause for a plane to go down or for a terrible fire to occur, as is occurring now in Southern California. And the same thing is true when you get these waves of terrorism. Uh, I am sort of the student of waves of terrorism and the theory propounded by David C. Rappaport at UCLA, one of our great terrorism scholars. But also, one of his proteges and a colleague of mine developed the theory himself of lone wolf terrorism, which he called lone wolf terrorism and technological terrorism, because the lone wolf terrorist relies on our new devices and the internet to put together his plans. I would also point out, in addition to that excellent summary that Tim just gave us, there is unfortunately a plague of suicide among former military veterans who were deployed multiple times in ways that really test the human psyche and the human spirit. Not to take away from these men, they're great men. They've rendered a service, and women too, I might add. But the suicide rate in say Iraq II war veterans is extremely high. And a member of my family was a victim of that. So families have been affected. Add to that COVID, the isolationism that was enforced upon us by COVID, not by Anthony Fauci. I mean, he was following standard public health knowledge at the time, the best knowledge we had. And he explains that in his book. But we learn as we go, and it had fallout. And that fallout has increased alienation within the United States. No, we're not bowling together. And there have been times when a country urbanizes, you get alienation, you get extended families broken up, you get support systems breaking down. We've come to a peak of that in terms of people not even wanting to get married anymore, not having a life partner, going through serial relationships, not having children in their old age, a lot of lonely people. So all of these things come together in this perfect storm. And what we have are these phenomena arising under another perfect storm that has converged, and that is the emergence of neo-fascism after World War II in the Western world, particularly, and the uncertainty and suspicion of the nation state and how they want to break this down and encourage skepticism about it and negativity and even apocalyptic worldview. If you tune into Steve Bannon, he's all into that. He embraces a prophecy called the fourth turning, which I've analyzed and presents itself as some sort of historical rational thing, which really just totally bonkers. And so we have all these things coming together. And we have this movement called the Prepper movement, which formerly we knew as the survivalists. They were kind of under the radar group of people, largely apocalyptic religiously, expecting the apocalypse. A lot of people made a lot of money producing books on the apocalypse is coming. And it was always fast forwarded a little bit that they sold a lot of books because people had an apocalyptic mindset. And most prominent of that were I think 12 volumes of Left Behind, which is a restatement of the book of Revelation in the Bible. But it's expanded beyond that. It's expanded into the anti-government radical right, which was violent in the 1990s. And it has then been unleashed by the MAGA movement, which Trump, in his effort to cobble together any faction that will give him a vote, has basically unleashed the underbelly of American politics in all of these movements that we now see as Proud Boys, et cetera, that used to be movements called Aryan Nation and white nationalism and the Patriot movement and Pauci Comitatus that I studied for many years. And it's an outgrowth, ultimately, of the KKK, as Manfred has talked about before. But this is a short program. I'm not going to give a course on it, although I could. And what we have coming together at the wrong time is a sense of isolationism of America in the world, going it alone, telling other countries to go it alone, a deconstruction of the nation state, which has sustained us in peace for 80 years, a increasing mood of apocalypticism and uncertainty in the country, so that even, quote, ordinary people, civil servants, left-wingers, right-wingers, are now beginning to form networks of preppers for the coming civil war as they see it. No cause given necessarily, just an acknowledgement of polarization, loss of civility, as Tim has explained to us. So this prepper movement is now affecting about 20% the adult population in the United States, according to a recent New Yorker article.
Manfred, you're into political philosophy, and certainly you've observed and studied what happened in Europe. What is happening in Europe now? Is there an echo here? Is there a resonance between this set of circumstances, these factors, and what happened in Nazi Germany, or what is happening now in some of those right-wing countries, or countries moving right-wing in Europe?
I have something against this comparison, this American comparison constantly with political phenomena in this country with Nazi Germany. I don't think that applies. I think the United States has always been a place where a lot of nutty people got really a prominent public position. And this climate of political nuttiness certainly has always been enhanced by the Second Amendment. This is the only Western society that has a social contract without the prohibition of wearing arms. And so Americans have been shooting out, their differences for 200 years and have praised it, on television, Hollywood, the Westerns. This whole culture is soaked in this violent behavior that distinguishes it from other Western societies. Now, it doesn't distinguish it from countries like Haiti or the Sudan, where you have now really a total breakdown of social political order. I mean, we have not reached that point, but when you were talking, I think the only one who mentioned that was Jean. We are talking now 2 weeks before the president, who you could really call a lone wolf if I would use your decisions, coming into power. Now, the question is, how was that possible? Now, that is a frame, I think, that is very, very peculiar to the United States. Now, you have some nutty places in Europe. In Austria, you may get a right-wing character become chancellor. You may have in France, before 27, Marine Le Pen coming into power. You have in Germany, elections in February, and you don't know what happens there with the AfD, since Musk, went in there and supporting the AfD. He made some similar nutty comments about Great Britain, and Europeans consider him, even though he is an immigrant, from South Africa, a typical American nut. I mean, he's a genius on one hand, technologically, financially, but politically, he's an idiot. But Americans do not seem to look at him as an idiot, and they don't look, at all of the other characters that surround the lone wolf president who will come into power in 2 weeks in the same way.
Manfred asked a rhetorical question about a lone wolf president. How is this possible? Now, maybe that was a rhetorical question. Maybe it was a real question. Using your terminology, Manfred, nutty, it takes nutty people to elect nutty people.
Right.
And, we could blame it on economic hardships, but I'm not buying that. I mean, yeah, in the Depression in 29 and, 30 in the 30s, people were going without food. We had soup lines, we had bread lines. People were going hungry. I don't think that's happening now. Yes, we have a significant number of people living paycheck to paycheck and not a lot of savings, but they're not going hungry. So as much as we like to point a finger at economic hardships and hard times is why they're hiring a radical, I think there's something more to it. And I think there's some disturbed voters out there that we're not accounting for because it's politically non-correct to say we got some nutty voters out there. And it's time we start acknowledging that the nutty voters is the tail wagging the dog.
All things considered, these factors which we essentially agree are in place and moving forward in a very discouraging dynamic. Let's look at the dark side for a minute, just for a minute, and I wonder where it goes. And this is the question I put to you: how it can be reversed, if at all. What do we do to return, to civility? Some people think that the 19th century was a very violent time. And it was all about the OK Corral and everybody carrying weapons and shooting people. And maybe we get that as a matter of mythology from the movies and the literature at the time. And then somewhere along the line, we got to be more civil, or at least we valued civility more than we did before. But we're headed into a time now where we don't value civility. So that the civility we enjoyed for a while was like a break. It was temporary. And now we're going back to our true nature, which is a nature of violence. Some people feel that way. And I wonder if there's, a way, at least in your analysis, of reversing this trend and coming back to civility.
What key element influences human nature? What's persuading human beings in this country? I'll just keep it to this country. That's mass media. That's TV. We have radicalized AM radio as far as on the MAGA side. We have social media from a billion different sources. Other than the broadcasting stations of CBS, NBC, ABC, we have no regulatory filters to say what's being said is true or not true. Cable news doesn't have regulatory standards. Zuckerberg just mentioned he's going to reduce or eliminate fact-checking. If all day long people sit around and watch mass media in whatever form it takes, and they listen to that morning, noon, and night, there's something called subliminal persuasion, subconscious persuasion. In this case, it's conscious persuasion. And we're becoming a nation who is being persuaded by non-factual things. And our sciences are going by the wayside. People aren't defending science, basic medicine. The science in medicine is being discounted because we have people telling lies and getting away with telling lies, and we have no regulatory oversight. And the FCC did have a mission, but it's very, very contained to the 3 major network stations. Other than that, there's no truth in advertising, and there's no truth in broadcasting. And shame on journalists for participating.
Well, what's the answer to my question? What can be done?
First Amendment supporters won't like this, but it's time to institute, and I think Europe does this to some degree, standards on what you're getting away with if you have the public airways at your disposal. And I don't see anything wrong with it at this point because we're heading into that, what you like to call a sea change or a point of inflection. we're there. We're not getting there. We're there. And it's a matter of time of government intervention to say enough's enough. Any new frontier is without regulation. Look at the stock market. And look at the stock market and crashed and caused the depression. What happened after? Well, people woke up and said, oh, there's no regulatory oversight. Well, create this thing called the SEC. Okay? Our FCC is not doing its job because its hands are tied. It's time to expand that which was regulatory oversight should and ought to take place. Not restricting First Amendment freedoms, but a sense of decency and fact-telling. Now, not all facts are facts because we know it's a matter of interpretation, but at least, for God's sake, an attempt.
Jane, I'm reminded of Charles Dickens and the Christmas Carol and the ghost of Christmas future. And it's not a happy picture. And, Tim's answer to what can we do is sort of predicated on a better leader in government, which we do not have. And in fact, the likelihood is that he's going to be worse and his government is going to be worse. We'll see soon. But I put to you this, our show, our discussion today is based on what happened in New Orleans and Las Vegas. And they were both, lone wolves. And there have been many lone wolves, suicidal lone wolves in school classrooms and the like. There have been some groups, but for the most part, it seems to me we have lone wolves. And the question I put to you is, in the ghost of Christmas future, are these lone wolves going to get together? Are they going to start collaborating? Are there going to be, violent groups coming down the path here? How do you see the evolution of this social psychology?
Lone wolf terrorism is a concept that is well developed academically and intellectually, and it excludes them coming together. You can have lone wolf terrorism incidents with one or two people, not just one person. The point is they're not affiliated with a group. And then every group has what's called the morality of terrorism. Every terrorist group has its own standards of what is acceptable and what is prohibited. And when an individual from the terror group is out on a mission, his handlers and his superiors have to agree. The group has to agree. And this is what the originator of the theory said. So that's not on the table. What we see, though, if we go back to politically motivated lone wolf terrorism, and by the way, the definition of terrorism by the American intelligence community involves a political purpose to the terrorism, a mass audience, a shocking message. Terrorism is a message, and it's promoted through violence. And it's the thing about lone wolf terrorism is because these people are not attached to groups, you don't have any forewarning. You don't have any way of expecting this to happen. I mean, normally what terrorists do is they do reconnaissance on a site where they want to commit terrorism. And that, in fact, took place in New Orleans. The guy had been there before. But you can't identify somebody who's doing reconnaissance in a public area unless you've got an MO on this guy. You've been watching him or his group that he's associated with. This is the random nature of lone wolf terrorism. The other thing is they all do it for different reasons. They all have their personal reasons. I mean, MAGA spokesmen right now are trying to paint the New Orleans terrorist as an outreach of ISIS. And in USA Today, there's a ridiculous column that they printed that this individual is an example of ISIS coming to the United States, presumably over our borders, all those terrible illegals, and perpetrating this. That is not what is going on. The very definition of a lone wolf is that he is not being handled by someone overseas or some group that we can identify. He personally came to that. The guy in Las Vegas seems to have been primarily suicidal. He wasn't engaged in this homicide by vehicle, which, by the way, has happened in Europe too. It happened horribly in Nice. The worst example of it was in Nice, France. I think 86 people died. And so this has been going on in the Western world. And that makes it, according to Rappaport's definition, a fifth wave of international global terrorism. And the last wave we had was religious terrorism, starting in 1979 with Al-Qaeda and then the Islamist terror groups. But now we've morphed not into an ISIS in the United States, but into lone wolf violence. And yes, we have to examine the reasons why. To be a lone wolf, most of the time, yeah, you are suicidal, but you express that homicidally. The guy in New Orleans was going to kill his family, and then he decided instead he would kill a bunch of strangers. You have to feel alienated. And alienation is something that increases in our society under certain conditions. And one of those conditions is the breakup of the extended family, then the breakup of the nuclear family, then the mobile nature of our not having a community in one place to identify with, not having a cemetery to go to where our ancestors are buried, not having a public square, not knowing your neighbors, breakdown of community, and I think we really need to start looking at this now, the decline of the mainstream churches and synagogues in this country, that they are losing they are losing their congregations. People are opting for a vague spirituality. What people need to understand about religion is that it is a community thing. It's a family thing. It is an intentional community. It is not necessarily about belief in God and how I pray and faith and all those things. Decline of the congregation, the numbers of people who are going to church, who are going to synagogue, who are going to the temples, to their mainstream religions. I mean, we had offshoots. Our religion today is very freeform, apocalyptic, mega. It's like political movements, which is why we talk about Christian nationalism. It's disassociated from community. It's not in the traditions and the guidelines and the wisdom of a collected, mainstream, institutionalized religion. And if we were to get back to that more, we would find perhaps a renewed sense of community that we need. But as long as we're being atomized and alienated, we're going to see the epidemic of public violence. And I have to disagree with Manfred, despite all the Westerns I used to watch and love. Our country is not more violent than any other group of people in the world or in the West. It's just that it has made a sacred fetish out of the ownership of guns. And when people become alienated, suicidal, they sometimes become homicidal too.
Manfred, let's go back to you for a minute about Trump's efforts to communicate with, affect, even pitch a program through Elon Musk to the AfD, to groups in the UK, and I don't know where else. And we find, many countries in Europe moving to the right, and Trump wants that. That's part of his agenda. At the same time, and this is where I get stuck. At the same time, we're supposed to be living in an isolationist world where he doesn't want anything to do with anything offshore. So my question to you is, do you have an idea about why he is taking all these international steps and trying to affect international events and trends and sea changes, if you will, when he's supposed to be an isolationist? What does he hope to achieve with that?
I'm at a complete loss at that issue. And I don't know whether Musk is on a mission for Trump, or whether that is his personal mission that he tries to sell to Trump by moving around now in all kinds of European countries and creating havoc there by doing that. But and it may really very soon come to a confrontation between Trump and Musk, because Musk seems to be stealing a lot of Trump's presence in the media. But when you are talking, let me come back to what Jane was talking about, these lone wolves. You know, you had recently, before Christmas in Germany, a very bizarre incident where you had a Saudi doctor driving with his car in a Christmas market and killing people. And why did he do it? Because he was against ISIS. He was against not only ISIS, he was a secular Muslim, he was against Islam. So here you have a Saudi, originally a Muslim from an Islamic country, going against his own religion. Now, people still do not completely understand what that was all about. And I think we have to be careful when making these very, very tight connections that Jim and Jean to some extent, and you, Jay, also draw, when you connect all of these nuts and idiots and, people who are casualties of whatever alienation.
Yes, we have violence, we have terrorism, we have carnage, we have isolation, mental health issues, polarization, dehumanization, loss of caring and civility, and suicidal ideation in Europe too. And I can't speak to whether it's more or less, or whether it's motivated by the same issues and, trends in Europe as it is here. But my question is this moving east or is it moving west? Are they getting it from us? Are we getting it from them? Or is it running completely independent in both places?
I think it's running completely independent. There is no connection, at least at this point. What happened in Austria or in Germany or in Britain or France, I do not see the connections, even if some right-wing connections exist. You have a right-wing meeting of political groups in the European Parliament. But I do not think that you have a connection at this point. It's not a global right-wing fascist movement in the making. You have these fascist or proto-fascist characters floating around everywhere. But I mean, when you talk about this syndrome of the lack of civility, I mean, you praise the 50s and 60s or 70s. I don't know how far you go back and come to the present as an age of civility. Well, yes, for a lot of people it was. For Black people in America, it was not. So please do not celebrate, a climate that applied, a political climate, a cultural climate that applied to millions of white Americans, but not to millions of Black Americans. So you have had this, unwillingness of white Americans to see this as part of their history. Now, in Europe, you have the migration issue, especially for some strange reason, especially in Austria, because you have much more immigrants living in Germany than in Austria, percentage-wise, Ukrainians as well as Syrians. And you may get in the elections in February in Germany a response to that. I do not think the AfD will reach the Christian Democrats as it happened in Austria, with the FPÖ coming going beyond the ÖVP, the Christian the equivalent of the Christian Democratic Party in Germany. But the AfD may move up to 20% or 22%, but will not reach the Christian Democratic Party, which will, I think, form the government.
I do not look upon these events in isolation. And the reason for that is my theoretical perspective. I come from a generalist field called the history of religions, which developed in Europe through biblical criticism and objective and anthropology. And that history looks for trends, looks for connections, looks for paradigms, patterns in human history. And human collective behavior does have patterns that repeat itself. Not that we're repeating exactly what happened in Nazi Germany, but the pattern, the predictions based on it, the anticipations, the analysis holds. And to my surprise, because I first started writing about this in 2017, and I didn't expect the pattern to hold. In fact, the pattern held. Theoretically, we disagree. But that doesn't mean that we disagree in what we're seeing and how to regard it. I think there are many points here between a political scientist and a historian of religion that we can agree upon. But I'm just trying to emphasize that analysis is something we need at a time when we're hit with so many new things so fast. We have to make sense out of it before we can evoke a response to it, which you asked Tim about. Yes, there are ways we can overcome this. Yes, there are ways we can respond. And I am not depressed about it. I am interested in it, but I'm not depressed about it.
Okay, Tim, we don't have time to go around the table, but I would like to get your final thoughts here anyway. So could you give us your final thoughts on this discussion?
It does come down to, and I'm going to have to disagree with Manfred, and it does come down to Americans and how they're being treated at the workplace, how they're being treated in society. And again, I agree from a racial standpoint, there's importance of dignity and respect. And I think all you have to do is drive our freeways and side streets and look at the cases of road rage, not only in this state, but across America. And people have red hot tempers, and their vehicles are basically as a delivery means of their tempers. And road rage is very high on the list. An example of disrespect and lack of respect. So if you want to stop lone wolf situations, we got to go from square one, and that is, all individuals from the time they're a child, there has to be an attempt to treat them with dignity and respect. Otherwise, you'll have them gravitate towards those sources that gives them power, the empowerment of the social media. Institutions, look at the amount of violence that takes place in prisons and why recidivity is such a commonplace in prisons. Well, that's where you go to learn violence and crime. And so we have institutions that train us violence. The military trains you how to kill, but they don't know how to turn off the switch on how to kill. We have to look at all bases of society to say, where does this generate and how can we amend it so that people are not mentally damaged, spiritually damaged by how they're being treated in this society.
Okay, we're out of time. We'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much, Tim Apicella, co-host, Jean Rosenfeld, and Manfred Henningsen. Thank you so much, all of you. I'm your host, Jay Fidell. We'll see you again soon. Aloha.